Afternoon, and thank you for joining us with Online with LSC. Our moderator for today is Dr. Sarah Eady, and she will be introducing Dr. Paul Hernandez.
Great. Welcome everyone to Online with LSC, and thank you for joining us today. So just a reminder, the goal of this webinar is to be like a virtual journal club, really get behind the scenes on how education articles are made and kind of give insights on the results that are found. There is a Q&A feature built into Zoom here. That's at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring that for any questions that you want to submit, and then I will share those, okay? So you can see a picture of it on the screen now. So if you use that Q&A function, I will see that, and I'll pull questions from that to share with Paul. So please use it, and please provide questions. I have some scripted, but would much prefer to share your questions. So I would like now to introduce Paul Hernandez. He's an educational psychologist at West Virginia University. His research informs efforts to increase persistence of underrepresented groups in STEM, and he's been working in this area for 12 years or so. One of his major contributions to biology education research is his focus really on the processes that are going on that can lead to these gaps that we see in persistence. He's especially focused on the role of motivation and sort of social influences on student persistence. So one of the things that I've really admired about Paul's work is how careful his experimental designs are and his obvious competency with a variety of really exciting statistical techniques. So today we're gonna explore both. We're gonna explore the processes going on in undergraduate research experiences and how his studies are planned and executed to see how this all works. So now I'd like to turn it over to Paul to introduce us to his paper titled Student Integration into STEM Careers and Culture, a longitudinal examination of summer faculty mentors and project ownership.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that. Very nice introduction. So as Sarah said, I'm Paul Hernandez. I've been working on really trying to use motivation and social influence theories from social psychology and educational psychology to understand why students continue on and persist into a professional role over what is really quite a lengthy process, lengthy traineeship, starting certainly before college, continuing through college, and then ending up, in the profession either before or after graduate school. So what I was trying to do in this particular study was summarize what my understanding of the literature where it stands. That is to say, undergraduate research experiences, or UREs, we can again and again look across the literature and see that they're linked to these beneficial outcomes, deeper learning of content knowledge, really discovering and understanding the nature of science, a variety of benefits for self-perceptions in terms of confidence and developing a professional identity, and ultimately intentions to continue on in a career and actual persistence and scientific career paths. And there's this growing understanding that it's, the black box as it started of a research experience, we're kind of peeling back layers to identify the critical features of that experience. And those features can be found from the micro level, of how a student interacts with a task, all the way up to more macro levels of the context within which research happens. And that context, that kind of more macro level context of where the research happens and the climate within which it happens and the relationships that are formed. More so than the science, that's those relationships and context that I look at or have been looking at as a researcher. So from that research, identified several critical features that are beginning to be or continue to be recognized. One of them that's relatively newer is the sense of project ownership. That's just students own sense that this is their project. And that sense of ownership is actually linked to several important theoretical models in educational and social psychology. And then also the relational aspect, that is to say, the relationship and the quality of support received from a mentor. And those two things are what I kind of honed in on for this particular study. My other research had kind of been leading me in this direction. And so the gap that I was trying to address is really bringing to bear this educational and social psychology theoretical lens to understand the developmental process that happens in a summer research experience. As students come in and as they go through the experience, what are the factors that are associated with beneficial outcomes for them? And so that theoretical lens that I used in this paper is known as the tripartite integration model of social influences, just TIMSI for short, because that's quite a mouthful. The TIMSI model is a social influence model, and it says that, people are often involved in contexts and relationships where influence takes place. And we can think about the apprenticeship of a student pursuing or aspiring perhaps to pursue a career in the sciences as one that involves social influence. And that social influence model says that, there are people and there are contexts that help people integrate more deeply through this social influence process, that draw them into the discipline, help them to internalize and identify the norms, the attitudes, the behaviors that are required to be successful, and help them to internalize those and to identify with those, and if not, simply to comply with those. So that's what the TIMSI model kind of, the framework posits. And within that model, what I've done is I asked several, but I'm just going to focus on two research questions. One, do project ownership and mentorship influence changes in students' scientific research career intentions over the course of a summer undergraduate research experience? Like, do these critical features of the experience that'll vary from student to student, do they influence intentions? And two, do they influence intentions over the course of that summer because they have influenced what TIMSI identified as important kind of psychological mechanisms of self-efficacy, identity, and internalizing the values of the scientific community? And that's what I show kind of down here at the bottom of the model. That's what that A path, B path, and C path are about, where your outcome over on the right-hand side is your scientific research intentions measured at 3-point time points, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the summer research experience. And then you've got these contextual features all the way on the left, and these are the facets of the research experience that I would expect to be operating as kind of these influential facets of a research experience: their sense of ownership over the project and a variety of qualities of mentorship. And if that second research question is on target, it would say that the contextual features of the research experience at the midpoint of the research experience are then influencing efficacy, identity, and values over and above the influence of efficacy, identity, and values that students come to the experience with. And it's from the A path through the B path that project ownership and mentorship influence persistence intentions. So to jump quickly over the methods here, this is a study of 203 undergraduates enrolled in an 8 to 10 week summer undergraduate research experience here at WVU. It was a repeated measures design where we measured using surveys at the beginning when they started their experience. Really, the week one was they kind of during their introduction to the summer experience, and at the midpoint between 4 and 5 weeks into the summer, and then in the very last week of their experience, we asked them that follow-up question. And I I and my team, we identified previously kind of established scales of the constructs we're interested in. And an important piece of this is that we were trying to account for kind of logical complications and understanding process or mediation. And so we did that, one, by using a repeated measures design, this longitudinal design, which has an intrapersonal focus. People are their own controls, as opposed to having an experimental control. There's no randomization in this study. So people operate as their own controls, and we're looking at change within person. And then two, we used a variety of other procedures to control for known statistical complications related to statistical assumptions and missing data and people being nested within different programs, model fit, and then, of course, because we have lots of tests, type 1 error rate inflation. And the take-home points are really summarized here in table 2. And so I'll walk you through the table. The top of the table lists the outcomes. So our science efficacy, identity, and values measured at time 2, that's the midpoint of the summer, are the first 3 outcomes. And the next 3 outcomes are all persistence intentions. The intercept is persistence intentions at the very end of the summer. Linear growth and quadratic growth are basically the curve of linear change over time in persistence intentions. Now, if I draw your attention to the blue box, I've tried to highlight it in blue, this is where, importantly, when we're predicting changes basically in efficacy, identity, and values, we're controlling for the efficacy, identity, and values that students came to the summer experience with. And these are unstandardized coefficients, but they're relatively large. And what they're saying is that, you know, students, a big determinant of their intentions, their efficacy, identity, and values at the midpoint of a summer of experience is where they started and that experience, and we have to account for that if we want to really have a better understanding of process. Now, if I show the red block with a red number 1 in it, that block with the number 1 really addresses research question 1, which is to what extent project ownership and mentorship influence how the change over time in students' intention to pursue a research career. And what we see here is these 2 negative coefficients. What those 2 negative coefficients mean in terms of all the coding, jumping to the end of the story, is that students who have lower levels of project ownership, they have this swing in their intentions. What happens with their intentions is there's this deep swing downward. They start relatively high, and then they have a decline in their intentions toward the midpoint of the summer, and then it swings back up. That's just what happens for most students. But the higher that students have a sense of project ownership, they don't have that deep swing. They have basically a level, steady kind of, it's either steady or a slight growth in terms of their intentions over the summer. So higher levels of project ownership are associated with more stable intentions over the course of the summer, as opposed to this dramatic swing. The red boxes with number 2s on them, those are essentially addressing the second research question. That is to say, does mentorship, to what degree does mentorship have an effect on persistence intentions because of its effect on efficacy, identity, and values? And what you can see in the first red number 2 boxes, that role modeling aspects of mentorship are having this positive influence on the development of identity and the internalization of scientific community values. And ultimately, this is the second box, number 2, says that it's the depth of the internalization of scientific community values, discovery, sharing ideas, talking with others about what you've discovered. It's those values, internalizing those values, that predicts having higher levels of persistence intentions at the end of the summer. And so that's the summary of the paper. I'll stop there and leave time for questions.
Great. Thank you for that. That was awesome. So I guess I wanted to start sort of back at the beginning of your process here. We're already starting to get questions, which I'll add in as well. But how did you decide that mentoring would be the variable about the undergraduate research experience, or project ownership, either one, whichever you want to talk about, would be the ones to focus on? There's so many dimensions by which it varies, and you mention a lot of them in your paper. What were you drawing on to make those decisions?
So I was really drawing on my own interest in undiscovered questions. So I think that, and I'm going to misattribute this, but one of my mentors told me a while back that, you know, to be a good researcher, you kind of have to have an axe to grind. And my axe to grind is really unpacking mentorship. Mentorship is this really kind of amorphous blob of a construct that people ascribe a variety of great benefits to. And given the design of most studies, we don't know if it's mentorship or if it's particular aspects of mentorship, the timing of mentorship and when it happens and what kinds of support. We just don't know enough about the nature of that relationship and how it influences important outcomes. Nor do we know enough about the processes through which mentorship is a relationship with you and another person, or you and many other people. You know, we can have networks of mentors. And so my axe to grind has been for a while now trying to be more precise in the kinds of support that a senior person provides to a junior person, when that support matters, and the type of support when it matters, right? Because there's a lot of dimensions of mentorship. If we can think of, you know, dozens, if not more, facets of a research experience. But if we take one of those, mentorship in particular, we can think about a variety of aspects in which that particular facet, in this case, a relationship, can vary. And so that's really what I've been focused on for the last 4 or 5 years, is trying to better understand this relationship and when it matters, because I think that there's a coming realization that mentorship is not the answer for everything, but it is the answer for some things.
Great. And so I guess to build on that, you measured, I think, 4 different dimensions of mentorship, and it really was only role modeling that came out to be important or predictive in your model. And so I was wondering, could you really define for us how role modeling was different than your other variables for mentoring, and why you think that was the important one?
Sure. So the axes on which mentorship is typically measured are psychosocial support. You can think about this as psychosocial emotional support. This is kind of the encouragement, the positivity, the emotional support and rapport that a mentor builds with their mentee. There's instrumental support, which is more task and skill related. So these are the skills that one helps a junior colleague develop by giving them challenging assignments, by helping them overcome challenging assignments when they get stuck. And it's really that kind of instrumental technical aspect. A third aspect that is much less well understood within the mentoring literature is role modeling. And that is to say, the degree to which the mentee identifies their mentor as someone that they aspire to be like, someone they identify with. And this is really, they get to choose. You could be a mentor in some ways, but not be a role model. We can probably all think of faculty in our own, or career professionals who have gone down a path we wouldn't choose to go down, you know, in terms of perhaps work-life balance or something like that. So they are not a role model in some regards, but they can still provide different kinds of support. So role modeling is much more passive. It's the degree to which a mentee says, I want to be like you, and I want to adopt the norms, attitudes, and behaviors that you're displaying so that I can become like you. And then the last facet here is just overall satisfaction. There are actually other facets that I didn't measure, but overall satisfaction is supposed to be kind of this cumulative, if you aggregate across all of the different kinds of support, that degree of satisfaction is supposed to be predictive of other proximal outcomes like intentions and attitudes and so forth. So I think there's a growing understanding that the inspiration that students or aspirants draw from their mentors is a really important and undervalued facet of what's happening. You might get a question on a psychosocial support scale about whether or not someone sees their mentor as a role model. But that's not doing a good job of measuring role modeling. Role modeling is really the degree to which someone identifies a person as having the career that they want and the life that they want, and they're being inspired to follow in their footsteps. So truth be told, there's a whole nother literature on role modeling that hasn't very well cross-sectioned with mentoring literature from kind of the experimental social psychology realm, which really looks at role models who actually don't provide any support other than inspiration, and how that can have an either important motivating effect on students or career aspirants, or a demotivating and thwarting effect on career aspirants. So that's why I picked those ones as major facets. And I'm not super surprised that role modeling turned out to be I'm a little bit surprised that the others were not predictive, but they were all correlated, right? But it's when you go into the unique prediction model that it's just role modeling that wins out. And it's this inspiration where, if you think about the context, this might not be the same if we look at a year-long research experience or a research experience outside of this compressed, 8 weeks. This is quite a unique experience for students where they are for 40 hours a week, probably for the first time ever, working in science, doing science. And so this, looking at their faculty member who's kind of over their research, this is a highly compressed and kind of a pressure cooker of, do you want to do science? And do the role models around you, in this case it's talking about a faculty, are they inspiring you to continue to want to do science? It could be that that's most important here, because for a lot of students, this is the first time they've met anyone on campus. They've traveled from afar, most of them. And so they might not be able to develop psychosocial emotional support. They might not be getting strong levels of instrumental support from the faculty member. But what they may be doing is drawing on, well, is that person living the life I want to someday lead? And that might, in this context of summer UREs, I don't know if this bears out in other contexts, but that might be why it's kind of winning the tug of war over prediction.
Cool. So we got a question from one of the folks joining us about, if mentoring and role modeling is so important, they're encountering mentors who are hesitant to reveal personal information to students. And so they're wondering if you had run into this, and if you had any tips or, data or ideas that they could share with their mentors to maybe help them see why this is so valuable. And I think your paper is part of that. But do you have like little tidbits that, they could drop in?
I think that's a great question. And it is tough as a professional, one, to find time to work, one-on-one with an undergraduate. But let's just assume that's the case, that you find the time, that your mentors find the time to do it. How are they going to spend that time? One of the things that I think could be important in this discussion is not all aspects of mentoring may be important at all times. So as you can see here in table 2, psychosocial emotional support is that self-disclosure. That's that kind of, some of the questions on that scale ask about the degree to which, the mentors have provided emotional support by talking about themselves. And so in this context, it didn't really matter. So that's one. If you've got a mentor who provides some kinds of support and not all kinds of support, that may be sufficient. It might be about finding the right fit between a mentee who really is looking for skill development and instrumental support, and helping them to recognize that not every potential mentor you have will have a deep emotional bond with, but you can still benefit in other ways from the kinds of support that they are able to provide. So there are individual differences that I'm not sure we can strong arm people into doing things that they're emotionally not ready to do. So that's the first thing. But that doesn't mean that that person can't be a good mentor by providing other kinds of support. So that's one. Two is it doesn't, I think it might be helpful for some who are perhaps hesitant but willing under the right circumstances to do some self-disclosure, to go through a structured process. So the folks over at the University of Wisconsin WISC Center, Chris Fund, and colleagues out there, they have a really fantastic set of entering mentoring and entering research curriculum that are by and large free. And one of them that that I really like has to do with a mentor biography. And this is a little packet of questions. It's just several questions that the students are directed to sit down and ask and kind of interview the faculty about their path to get to where they are. And I think what's nice about that is that it may lead to more emotional type of self-disclosure or not, but in either case, for helping students to understand the path towards success is going to provide potentially psychosocial emotional support, but certainly it could provide role modeling support, because part of role modeling is that role model helping you to identify the steps to be successful, in addition to kind of the attitudes and the norms and the behaviors that it takes to be successful. So that role model or that mentor biography can be quite helpful in a process. And it doesn't have to necessarily go into kind of the softer, more emotional kind of vulnerable state that some folks would like to have with their mentor.
Great, thank you. To turn this a little bit, we're getting a couple questions around self-efficacy, science identity, and science values. So the first one is, do you feel that those three scales gave you enough nuance to really see what was going on for students, or is there something in the future or other aspects you think should be considered when we're thinking about these experiences?
Well, I purposefully measured efficacy, identity, and values because of the way that they aligned with the theoretical model that I was using. So it's really important to pick carefully to make sure there's a real close alignment between your measures and your theoretical model. And I didn't use extremely long scales, right? There's always this, I would love to give scales with lots and lots of questions to get into lots of sub-facets of these things. But there's this kind of trade-off between survey completion and minimal sufficiency in terms of measuring. But the short answer is, yes, the way that I have measured efficacy in terms of the Chemers scale on confidence to complete specific tasks has been shown to correlate and even predict, really reasonable and desirable outcomes, not just persistence, but also other attitudinal and behavioral outcomes. So that's that was a fine measure to use. There I'm sure there are others, but it did have quite the expected degree of correlation with the other measures, the expected level of sufficient reliability. So it was operating as it should, as we would expect. And the same goes for the other two measures in terms of Chemers developed that identity measure, and then Mika Estrada developed the values measure. So I think that, for what they were intended to do, they did it sufficiently well, although certainly they could be done even better with longer surveys, or even, kind of a multimodal way. It just didn't fit into the context of this study.
Mm-hmm. And so another question related to that is, if we know that the self-efficacy students have, or the identity or the values they have coming into these experiences is important, do you think that that would suggest that we should be doing something before they come into the experience to help build those things up? So this person is thinking about how do we set them up for success in, I think they're thinking about, I don't want to put words in their mouth, setting them up for success ahead of time. Is that something you've thought about or could speculate on?
So I'll speculate on it, right? So how do we, so I think the question that I'm hearing and we'll try to answer is how do we set students up for success in a summer research experience? And I think that perhaps one of the ways that we do that is giving earlier access, earlier tastes at what real research feels and looks like. There was this general decline in interest in research careers from the first to the second time point. And that general decline in persistence intentions was due in part, I think, and I haven't asked these questions, I'm just trying to infer from the literature and from colleagues that I've talked about with the ambiguity and the difficulty with engaging in kind of an authentic experience, 40-hour work week of engaging in science, identifying and defining a problem that has to happen in those first couple weeks, surveying the literature to get up to date on what's known about the problem space that you're working in, and then identifying a useful research question that will be of interest not just to you, but also to the community at large. And then developing the methods in those first few weeks to analyze, developing an experiment in the first few weeks. So I think part of that initial general decline is the ambiguity and the difficulty involved in jumping into a research endeavor and defining that space in a compressed period of time. So, were I to have advice, I think part of it would be to engage students in kind of more authentic research where there is ambiguity, perhaps, structured experiences before they do these more individualistic experiences. So they're not jumping in kind of blind. The more we can pull back the veil and say, okay, this is what science is like, and help students to incrementally engage in it until they're ready for this fairly high level of independence. For them, high level for them. I know everyone who leads RU knows that the students are not independent. I'm not saying they're independent. What I'm saying is for them, it's a higher level of independence. And pulling back that veil little by little and giving them more time to engage with it, to watch others engage with it. I tend to fall back to things like the social cognitive theory Bandura put forward some, 3 decades ago, talking about the ways in which students build confidence and ultimately deepening levels of interest in a particular area, in this case, aspiring to be a researcher, has to do with watching others be successful, peers and experts, seeing them be successful so that observational learning, mastery experiences that they can engage in. So, actually getting their hands on real experiences, be it in a classroom or somewhere else, maybe outside of the classroom, a co-curricular experience, leading up to this, what I just think for them is their first full-on experience of, I am now a scientist. For the next 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 40 hours a week, I'm being and doing science, and that's my job. The more we can scaffold for them that process, the better that they will do. And if we can scaffold for them that process, they will, by that scaffolded process, develop confidence or efficacy. They'll begin to see themselves as a scientist and doing the work and engaging in the community of science, and also internalizing some of those values in science in terms of discovery, iteration, communication.
Great. I just wanted to pull back a little bit too and ask you now a little bit about your methods. So you're using structural equation modeling. And that's actually not super common, and you're not going to see it a lot in LSD. It's in there, but not everyone is using it. And so I guess I'm wondering, could you explain why you used that method for this study? Why was it appropriate? And could you talk to us about when a researcher should consider this method?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typical, what you may typically see when someone wants to understand process, and what I mean by that is the reason why an experience has an effect on an outcome. So I've backed my slides back up to this figure where I'm showing that contextual features may lead to scientific career research intentions. That's what you see by this arrow leading from contextual features at the midpoint of the experience to persistence intentions over time. So it's fairly straightforward and typical to see in a lot of research. These things are simply measured at a single time point, and then you throw it all into some kind of correlational analysis like regression. And you can analyze those correlations, and you can even, in a regression framework from cross-sectional data, say as an alternative to what I did, I could have just gone to the very last week of the experience, handed out a survey, asked questions all at the end. What kind of experience do the students have in terms of project ownership and mentorship as they think about the last 8 to 10 weeks? I could ask them about their level of efficacy, identity, and values, and I could ask them about their intentions at the end to pursue a research experience. Now, that's a fairly typical model. The problem is that, in order to get an understanding of process, what happened, what changed, and why did it change, we need to have temporal ordering established. If I were to ask a question, a survey, just at the end of the experience, there's no real way to establish what happened first, right? Did X lead to Y, or did Y lead to X, or did they just correlate and neither led to anything other than mere correlation? And so that's why I tend to rely on longitudinal designs with at least 3 measurement occasions in order to look at trajectory over time. And that was one of my goals here, is to look at how do scientific career aspirations change over the time and in this intensive experience. Now, once we move to repeated measures design, that simple regression technique is no longer going to be appropriate because now we have multiple outcomes, which is terrific because now we can establish temporal ordering in a more rigorous way. We know what came first, we know what came second, and we know what came third because we measured it at those time points. We don't have to have people imagine how they may have thought that they felt at the beginning. Right? We just measure in this moment what's happening and how do you feel. And then later in this moment, what's happening now and how do you feel. And we can use that, the logic of temporal ordering to help us figure out the process. What happened when, what changed because of it, and what was the ultimate outcome. And so with structural equation modeling, it's just a vehicle for incorporating that temporal ordering into the model. And so as you can see here with this what I have on the slide is a conceptual diagram of, I'm looking at the influence of these contextual features, which the students didn't know about. When they came in, we couldn't ask them about their level of mentorship support and their project ownership in the first week of the experience because they hadn't done anything yet, right? They were just meeting, many of them were just meeting there, or they may not have even been assigned a lab yet. So it wouldn't be possible at the first time point for us to ask them questions about the quality of the relationship of support, ask them about the degree to which they owned their project, because they wouldn't have anything. They might have given us responses, but they would not have been valuable. So it was that midpoint where we asked those questions, and it was that midpoint then we said, okay, these facets of the experience are likely to be influencing efficacy, identity, and values, but it's not as if efficacy, identity, and values simply appear out of the blue at the midpoint of the experience. Students come to the experience with a high degree of and some variability in their confidence, their identity as a scientist, and how much they value the community values in the scientific values in the scientific community. And so we have to control for that. That allows us to basically statistically control for, and then basically look intrinsically or in an intrapersonal way on how these contextual features are producing changes within a person in terms of their confidence, their identity, and values, and then and ultimately how those relate to change over time in persistence intentions. So structural equation modeling, back to the original question, is simply a multivariate technique that allows us to incorporate longitudinal designs in a really straightforward way. And those longitudinal designs are really the mechanism by which we can establish temporal ordering. And so that's the important piece. I could have used a different kind of analytic technique other than SEM, although I think SEM was perfectly appropriate here. SEM was the nice vehicle that could handle the repeated measures, multivariate kind of analysis.
Great. And we're also getting some questions about the participants in your study. One person would like to know the class standing, like was there a big range? Were they all early on? And then another person was wondering if you looked at demographic data and looked for patterns in this study or in another, do we see differences between different student groups?
So to the first question, there were a variety of rising what have you. Most of them were the vast majority were rising sophomores or rising juniors, and some rising seniors as well. So it was pretty much that. There might I don't have the paper up in front of me, but I do have that in the table in terms of where they were in their class standing. But rising juniors, rising sophomores, rising seniors. There was a bit of variability across those levels. I don't know to what degree that impacted any of these experiences, this model. Frankly, a sample size of 200 is kind of minimally sufficient to do this kind of analysis. Structural equation modeling is a large sample technique. Of course, you increase power when you've got repeated measures, but I wasn't able to, with any confidence, kind of split out the rising sophomores from juniors from seniors to look at if they had qualitatively different experiences or if this model operated differently across those different rising levels. I think that development, the point of development, might change some of these patterns, but I haven't been able to really ferret that out yet. That's kind of a future project. One of the projects I'm looking at now is trying to ferret out, are there particular critical points at which this model is, or different aspects of this model are important? But I don't have that data to hand yet. With regard to demographic characteristics, I have not seen and have not done yet, or at least I should say it this way, I've not published on yet, but I'm investigating some demographic differences in the TIMSI model. I've not seen yet reliable evidence that the TIMSI model works differently across different demographic groups. I haven't seen it work differently for men or for women, which is one of the studies I'm looking at now, but I haven't yet published on. I haven't found any reliable evidence that it works differently, that the social influence process works differently. And in fact, in some prior studies looking at primarily Hispanic and African American undergraduates pursuing STEM degrees, Mika Estrada and I have a paper, and I think she gave a talk a few months ago on a paper we published. We haven't yet found that the TIMSI model varies across those discrete demographic groups, but it may, and we simply haven't uncovered it yet. Something that has not yet been done is looking at the TIMSI model, comparing historically overrepresented and historically underrepresented groups to see if the socialization process or the social influence process operates differently across those two. Haven't seen that yet. So it doesn't mean it's not out there. It just means that we haven't discovered that that's the case. And if it is the case, if the socialization process works similarly across those groups, that would fit with theory that say that people in general, orient toward a social system by one of these three processes.
Great. So we have about 15 minutes left, and so I'm going to turn us to be more future focused. And there have been a couple of questions asking, are you going to continue following up with these students and look at, this is their self-reported persistence, but will you follow them to careers? Or are you thinking about, looking at these processes in under research experiences longer than the summer research experiences?
Those are both good questions. So to the first, am I going to follow these students? No. I didn't have the mechanism in place to follow them once they left. They were kind of a captive audience here. And I just didn't have the research infrastructure in place to follow them as they went back to their home universities. I have, though, and continue to be interested in this topic of not just intentions to persist, but actual persistence over long periods of time because of research experiences. And so a variety of my work with colleagues have looked at that, and will continue to look at that. So some papers that I would point folks to are looking at research experiences related to course-based research. Sasha, I'm forgetting her last name now, and so this is terrible, when you're on the spot. Erin Dolan, and Stasha is her first name. I'm forgetting her last name at the moment. Sorry. Rodenbush. Thank you. Yeah. So we have a paper looking at course-based research experiences and their relationship, not to psychological processes, just to persistence intentions. I've also got a paper with some colleagues, Mika Estrada, Anna Woodcock, and Wes Schultz, where we look at research experiences over the undergraduate tenure and how those relate to persistence in the field past graduation. And so that paper came out last year in Bioscience. And so it does appear that high intensity, that is to say more than 10-hour a week, and multiple semesters of research experiences have this persistent effect on who persists in science. Those two facets are really important. Intensive in terms of hours per week, and having at least 2 semesters of those experiences are important. But I'm going to continue to look at those facets, and that includes that paper with myself and Estrada, Woodcock, and Schultz. That includes summer research experiences. So these things are quite important. And my goal now is not just to look at the overall impacts, which is what those papers focused on, but to really look at the process. And that's, using models like the TIMSI model.
Great. So given kind of the results of this study, how do you see these results informing how we would design undergraduate research experiences, or how we would mentor mentors on how to design their undergraduate research experiences?
So I think there's some low-hanging fruit from this study. And so if I go back to this table, the role modeling effect is really important. Because there's actually quite a bit known about role modeling outside of mentorship that says that we can help students to identify more advanced peers or experts and help them identify through those examples of how to be successful. And so, helping them to identify, one, people that are similar to them, and people who are doing the thing they wish to do. And so this actually can come in the form of a one-on-one conversation where you kind of match people up. It can also come in the form of here's some short biographies of people who are like you and are doing the things you want to do, and they came through this program, or maybe they went through a similar program. So helping students to identify role models. And role models, again, it can be a mentor, but it could also be somebody who this student has never met and never will meet, but is living the life that they would like to eventually have, that they're aspiring to, and we can help them identify those role models who are similar to them, and the steps it took to go from where they are to where they want to be. You know, you can think about how many people were inspired to, pursue, careers in basketball from Michael Jordan, right? So he's this role model who's his actual footprint in terms of relationships is small, but his footprint as a role model and talking about the kind of work ethic and the steps to become a successful, sports star of decades ago, showing my age here, but is actually quite large because of that inspiration people drew from identifying the steps it takes to get there. And so that's low-hanging fruit because it doesn't actually take a relationship to identify mentors or to draw inspiration. But this can also be done through, structured processes. Like I said, the entering research curriculum has a nice little module that I use with my undergraduates, and the program here at WVU uses as a structured part of the process where they sit down, the undergraduates sit down, and they go through a short worksheet. It's an interview on a short biography of how their mentor got from where they were to where they are. And that can be quite helpful in terms of having the students identify with them as here's what it takes to be successful. And the more they can see themselves as being successful and following a similar path, the more inspiration that they could potentially draw from that person. On the other side, curriculum like Entering Mentoring, which is designed for mentors, if you can get them to engage with it, and I don't think there's yet a kind of a clear process. People who want to be better mentors will take advantage of those opportunities if you make them available. People who don't believe that they need to improve or don't have the time to engage in that structured process of entering mentoring curriculum or something similar, you're not going to get them. But that doesn't mean that they can't provide support. Part of it is changing the mentee's perspective on not the guru that they're working with, but how can I get what I need from a variety of mentors around me? Maybe I can't go to this person for deep emotional support, but they've got the skill set I need to learn from. And then I can get my emotional support from these people over here, even though it's not coming from here. And maybe this other person is going to be a sponsor and open doors for me and network for me, but it won't be everyone. So helping to turn our attention from the person to the network we help people develop is really important. And the work by Akins and came out a couple papers in CBE on that triadic mentoring structure is really important. Baronda Montgomery in her paper looking at a practice that you can engage students in to identify their mentor network, that is very useful for students to identify, oh, I don't have just one person who can provide me support. I can have this entire network and be very deliberate about where I'm going for different kinds of support. That is a really important process for all of us to learn, frankly. It's not just them. I learned by going through it too.
Awesome. And so I think my last question for you is, you've been doing these longitudinal designs for a while now, multiple studies. Do you have any recommendations for researchers who are thinking about using them to evaluate programs or interventions? Do you have any tips, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. So first is walk over to your ed psych department and find someone like me who can partner with you locally. There's ed psych departments on just about every campus, and people like me on just about every campus. So they might be a good resource for you. Two, if you're thinking about doing a longitudinal design, you've got to pick the context and the people very carefully, and you've got to make your messaging so that it's credible and people want to engage in it over a long period of time. Mika Estrada, Anna Woodcock, and Wes Schultz wrote a paper not too long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, called Tailored Panel Management, and that's the formula. I'd say it like that, but that's the methodology that I use to build rapport with my participants, to make sure that they're highly invested in also participating. They're not just a passive person who I'm asking favors of, which you kind of are when you're doing this, but it's a mutually beneficial experience. So Tailored Panel Management is a fantastic, very readable paper that's focused on how do you get participants to build their own sense of commitment to participate in your study over a long period of time. And I would just point people to that paper. It's a very practical paper, but it's highly theoretically based in terms of psychological literature and helping people to build commitment toward what becomes a long-term relationship. I'll just say, on another project, I'm 5 years out following a bunch of folks. We're coming to the end of that particular grant, and students email us. They know it's the time for them to start taking their survey. We'll get emails, hey, where's my survey? It's not here yet, right? And so we've built a relationship between this branded survey and that person through following things like Tailored Panel Management. So a little plug for that paper. It's really an important one.
Awesome.